All right. So this is sort of going into fortress conservation. I was going to have a longer lecture on Thursday, but um, the shot. So we're going to talk about global protected area trends throughout the years and their extent and how they changed, and then we're going to kind of just dip our toes into fortress conservation and community-based conservation. So changes in the, I guess, the amount of area that's been protected throughout the years. So there's been a variety of numbers. So Zimmerer et al. 2004 said that 1 million to 12.2 million kilometers squared was protected between 1970 and 1997, while Jenkins and Joppa sort of just look at a percent of global land cover. So we went from 3.5 to around 12% of the global land area being protected from 1985 to 2008. And this is just a figure from, I think it's probably, yeah, it's Joppa, Jenkins and Joppa, I believe. So this is showing sort of where the increase or decrease, the percent change in protected area occurred. So we see, let's see, so the darker the gray gets, the higher the percentage of land area change was. So we see a lot of dark areas around this northern Africa and a little bit south of the Sahara. We have increases from 5 to 24.9% around here in the Congo. And I think it's either Angola or Namibia. Um, I can't say for sure. But America, in, we increased by around 25 to 100%. So we gained like the same amount of protected area as we originally had at the beginning of 1985. So it's all looking like, for the most part, global land area that's being protected has increased throughout the years. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I guess, good things. So this is just another graph showing again that global land area increases. The amount of area that's being protected on the land is increasing, but this black line right here and right here and right here, the solid black line is showing the living planet index. So sort of a proxy for biodiversity. Um, it's supposed to be estimated from population sizes of around 1,600 vertebrate species. I was unable to look at Hales 2008, so I would definitely question their methods because it's really difficult to, I doubt, I highly doubt that there are actually population size estimates for 1,600 vertebrate species. Speaking as someone who does that for, my research, I estimate population sizes, and um, I'm pretty sure a lot of that is probably occupancy or extent of range or whatever. But we see that even while protected area coverage goes up, we see that I guess the health of the species that are present in these areas is actually going down, and that's from 1965 to 2005. So this is a paper about protected area downsizing, downgrading, and degazettement. I hope I say that right. And these are just three different things that could happen to protected areas. Downsizing is, as it says, it's shrinking the area that is being protected. So maybe the boundaries of the protected area are being redrawn and it's smaller this time. Downgrading means that it's less restrictive now. So um, possibly like turning a strict nature reserve into a less strict national park. And degazettement is means that you're just taking away the protected area designation completely. So there's it's no longer a protected area. And from I think yeah 1900 to 2010, Mascia et al. Found that um, there were, let me see, how many were there? I think there were over 500 of these events that occurred, and they only looked at areas in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So they don't look at the United States or anything like that, or Australia or Europe. But we see that these events are occurring a little less in South America, a little less in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe a lot in Eastern Africa, mostly in Asia. And this is just another graph that's showing that, and we can see throughout time, we have a higher number of these events occurring. So there's not a lot of loss of designation of a protected area. Protected areas aren't being um, de-protected. um, so protected areas are remaining protected areas even throughout this independence region, this years of decades of independence when Europe is pulling out of the developing world and countries are becoming more independent. We're not seeing protected areas really becoming or not changing into non-protected areas. But we are seeing some downsizing, a lot of downsizing, and definitely downgrading as in more recent years. And this is just another graph, sort of showing the same thing. And we could see that, yeah, there were some protected areas that were designated or changed to non-protected areas around the 1950s. So this is when countries are becoming more independent. They're gaining their independence from uh, their colonizers. But for the most part, it was just that one spike around the 1940s, 1960s. And then we see there's more downsizing um, throughout more recent years and also downgrading, a spike in around 2000. And this is again from Mascia et al. 2014. And this is showing, I think this line, 10% of the terrestrial area protected. So I think this was a goal at some point in the last century, the 1900s. This was a goal from one of those congresses or conferences that were talking about global biodiversity, and people wanted to get 10% of the global land area protected. So we got that broken down by the different countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and Caribbean. And we could see that for the most part, the amount of area that is being protected doesn't necessarily change. And for the most part, if it was over 10%, it's staying at 10%. The gray means that the protected area was, I think, downsized. Um, yeah, I want to say downsized. So this new line right here, the dotted line, and I think that's a more recent goal for protected area coverage. Um, we do see that a lot of countries aren't reaching that. Um, but for the most part in Africa, there doesn't seem to be that much change or that huge of a change in protected area coverage or designation or restrictiveness. Um, in Asia, we see that there's sort of less land actually reaching that that older 10% goal. And we do see some downgrading, downsizing, degazettement. And for Latin America, it seems like they're doing pretty good actually. So not a lot of change in protected area coverage and designation. And finally, so this is sort of kind of bringing back that idea of the living planet index sort of going down, even as protected area coverage is going up throughout the years. This is from Fuente et al. 2020. And what they did was they sort of looked at 10-kilometer buffers around these protected areas across the globe. And they wanted to see what was the change in sort of development within these buffer zones and even within the protected areas. So development means buildings being present, or I guess roads being built. And we can see that so within protected areas themselves, we get a lot of development, relatively a lot of development within Africa, within African protected areas. But this is like, wait, no. Oh, they have this totally wrong. Okay, sorry. I was reading it the wrong way. Okay, so we're actually seeing less protected development in protected areas in Africa, because this is build up less than 0.02% of the land area within protected areas in Africa are actually developed. And we see increases in, that's looking like Asia. I want to say China probably. Yeah, I think that's China. And a lot in Europe. And the orange is, or the median value, that's occurring in Siberia, Asia, big parts of South America. And then for the 10-kilometer buffers, so outside of the protected areas, how much is being developed? We see that again, not a lot is being developed in Africa or in Siberia, or Siberia, but there's a lot of development within these buffers surrounding the protected areas in Europe and I want to say China again. I'm not very good at geography. South Africa, Brazil, America, um, Mexico. So we're actually seeing less sort of incursion into protected areas in Africa than you would expect. So, oh God. Okay. Well, I had questions, but we'll just save it for, I guess next week is going to be mostly lecture. It's not going to be any readings because there's no time. So very quickly, just to give you guys a brief intro into fortress conservation and community-based conservation and what you're going to be reading about and discussing on Thursday. So fortress conservation, the whys of why fortress conservation, why we should be using fortress conservation, basically. We have a moral duty to conserve biodiversity. Extreme times call for extreme measures. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, and if we're going to protect biodiversity, we need to actually protect areas. Designated protected areas work, and they're also science-based, as opposed to maybe less science-based for community-based conservation, and also puts nature first. This is what fortress conservationists sort of put down as why we would want to focus on fortress conservation. Whereas community-based conservation is saying that we also have a moral imperative towards justice and fairness, including the locals and the indigenous people within the building of these protected areas. There's no such thing as a forest or ecosystem that hasn't had human influence, so taking humans out of the equation doesn't make sense. Grassroots, a lot of community-based conservationists proponents say that things are grassroots. So the conservation comes from the ground up instead of from the top down. And then also the idea of mixing Western science and local ecological knowledge is supposed to be a win-win. All right, so I just wanted to check in on that because a lot of what people seem to know about uh, fortress style protected areas are basically just protected areas. And community-based conservation is uh, sort of influenced by what you see or read or hear in the media, right? So I just wanted to see what your opinions were. We're going to kind of sort of break down all of these little factoids and see if the literature or the reality actually holds up to the image, I guess. So this is just a quote. Popularity of protected areas has come as an unwelcome shock for many conservationists. Uh, this is a quote from the Durban Conference in South Africa in 2003, the Fifth World Congress on National Parks. And it seems like people or conservationists kind of split into two camps, where half of them were mostly focused on things like poverty and social justice and making sure that um, indigenous rights were sort of upheld, acknowledged, preserved in regards to conservation. And then the other half of the conservationists were like, this is supposed to be a conference where we talk about conservation of wildlife and biodiversity, and focusing on indigenous people is good, but we should be focused on, conservation at this point right now. So it seemed like there was a little bit of tension between the attendees of that Fifth World Congress on National Parks. And I just really wanted to point out this bit. The image of global good guys is not only important for conservationists in regards to their self-image, so how they perceive themselves, how you might perceive yourself as a conservationist, but it's also essential to NGOs and conservation orgs that are using this image to fundraise. So there are a few reasons why protected areas in the fortress style aren't quite as great as proponents would like us to believe. Just a quick definition: strict protected areas, they're usually protected by fines or fences or force. You read in the paper that Namaka land is, they have the locals actually build the fence themselves as part of the development part of the park. So now that people can't go in, obviously, without being fined. Force is a huge thing that we're going to get into more in a couple weeks, 2 weeks to be exact. We'll be talking about force and green militarization, as it's called now. But usually when we're thinking about fortress style protected areas, we're thinking about areas that are sort of a direct tie to colonial game reserves and national parks. This idea of carving out areas on a map and then going in and kicking people out, even if they've lived there for their entire lives and they've had generations of their family live there. So do these times call for extreme measures? It's kind of, it really depends on your opinion. So if you think of it, obviously we're in a sixth-mass extinction. The background rate of species extinction is currently much higher than it should be. And we're seeing more species going extinct. We're seeing ranges contract. We're seeing populations decline. Obviously, that all puts a sense of panic into us and makes us feel that we do need to actually do as much as we can to conserve things. I'm not arguing with that. it's a very human reaction to the idea of loss. And if you think about it, like you can think about um, cardinals, for example. They're really common on the East Coast of America. And, you guys might not notice them. Me coming from California, I had never seen a cardinal before in my life. So the first time I saw one, I like stared at it for 10 minutes. Um, but even then, like if you think about maybe in the future where people are on totally different planet, maybe on Mars, for example, um, they'll only be able to see cardinals as pictures or in books or read or hear their songs on recordings. They might not ever see a cardinal ever in their life. And it's this idea of this is the only time in the 14 billion years of current the current universe actually existing that cardinals are present, they're existing. And if they go extinct, nothing, they will not come back ever again. um so if you think about extinction in that term, obviously it kind of ups the panic, it ups the feeling that we have to protect all that we can, um, just because every single species is so unique, and it's likely that nothing, well, it's a fact that they will not exist again. Maybe something that looks like it or fills the same niche as it will exist in the future, but a cardinal will never exist again, like a thylacine will never exist again. um, so if you think about it like that, yeah, you're going to think, okay, yeah, it's extreme times, we need extreme measures to protect things. But if you think of it in a bigger sense, and this is in the way, this is how I sort of keep myself from panicking about this kind of stuff. Um, yeah, if you think about it in a bigger sense, in a holistic sense, and this idea of Earth just being completely depopulated because of humans, that's never going to happen. Um, Even if we bombed ourselves with nuclear bombs and um, the world went under like an ice age for hundreds or thousands of years and humans went extinct, um, life will survive. Life finds a way, like Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park. Life will survive. It will come back again. It will evolve into new and strange forms. The Earth will always be here, at least until the sun eats it in billions of years. So if you think about it in that sense, it sort of calms you down and says, humans might cause a dent in species diversity. And yeah, cardinals will never exist if we kill them off now, but life in general will keep on. So this is really just a slide. It's your opinion. You just sort of have to um, think things through for yourself. Now, what I really wanted to get into is, do fortress style protected areas work? And hopefully, as you guys saw in last Tuesday's lecture, when I sort of went over protected area extent and everything, the answer is kind of eh. There's not a lot of studies on protected areas and how they actually um, protect things, which is crazy, right? Because like there's a lot of protected areas out there. But when people are actually doing studies of animals and they exist in protected areas, for the most part, they're doing studies that aren't comparing between populations outside of protected areas, inside of protected areas. Um, so what we see here is that, as you guys saw before, protected area size has been going up. The extent of the global protected area, um, land area has been going up throughout the decades, but living index, this supposed population index for 1,600 vertebrate species, has actually been going down. So protected areas aren't doing a lot when it comes to that index, which I still have um, reserves about, reservations about. So when it comes to Costa Rica, oh, it's not going to show it. Oh. Okay, so this paper comes from Costa Rica, and it's looking at the effectiveness of protected areas and stopping deforestation. And what they did was that they looked at multiple plots inside protected areas and outside protected areas and looked at the rates of deforestation. And what they found was that if a protected area hadn't been present in a certain forest, uh, maybe 10% of it might have been deforested by now. I think the years were, yeah, it was between 1960 and 1997 that they looked at this. So it's protecting about 10% of the protected area within Costa Rica. For birds, we're seeing that protected areas actually do sort of help populations of birds that are endemic, so only present in that region, or birds that are forest dependent, obviously, because of protecting the forest, you're going to be protecting the forest dependent species. And they're also looking at birds that are threatened or near threatened as listed by the IUCN. But for the most part, it doesn't, it's not necessarily the protected area that's protecting them. It's the forest, the fact that there's no forest loss and forest degradation happening. This paper compared protected areas and deforestation rates again across tropical belt, so Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Caribbeans. And what they found was that we see, actually, hold on. Okay, it's working. What we see is that we have what we're supposed to be looking at with this graph is that if you have your median value above 1, that means that the area is actually working, the protection is actually working, and it's reducing deforestation compared to outside the protected area. And if it's below 1, then what we're seeing is that it's not working, or it's actually more deforestation inside the protected area as outside. So what they saw was that protected areas reduced 13%, median value of 13% of deforestation by just being there. And this can all be pretty much explained by things like management, um, funds that the protected area actually has. So for example, if you have a protected area and you're enforcing it so that no one can go in, you obviously need patrols to make sure that no one is actually going in. And if you don't have money to pay these people, then you're going to have either no patrols or you're going to have very erratic patrols. And the protected area is just going to be protected on paper. So what we're seeing here in this graph from Geldman et al. 2020 is that protected areas aren't really working. They're not really protecting anything if the socioeconomic status outside of the protected area doesn't change. So um, if people don't have livelihoods that don't require them actually using the forest or the resources within the protected area, then it's not going to work because they still need the stuff that's in it, right? So they're still going to go in there, and it doesn't matter if it's supposed to be protected or not. They're still going to use the resources. They might be caught, they might be killed, they might be fined or jailed, but people are still going to be using the resources. Another paper saw that indigenous governance does help. So this outside inside clearing ratio is just how much forest outside the protected area is being taken down and how much forest inside the protected area is being taken down. If you have over 1, that's good. That means that more forest outside than inside is being taken down. And what we see is that whenever you put in indigenous people that are actually sort of leading things, making the decisions, administrating the actions, what you see is that you have this huge jump in the protection actually working, and less forest inside the protected area being cleared than outside. So, in summary, do fortress style protected areas work? Occasionally, they do work in slowing down deforestation. They do work in protecting sort of forest dependent species, but you have to think about the management of the protected area, the funds that they have to actually protect the area, and then also the socioeconomic status of the people living outside of the protected area. Because if they still need the resources within there, they're still going to use them no matter what. Our protected area is science-based. It's gotten better over the years. So nowadays we usually look at things like species ranges, and we'll kind of overlay those on a global map, and we'll find out hotspots of biodiversity or endemism, and we'll be like, okay, so this area over here in Madagascar should be protected because they got huge species richness, and they have all these little rare species that we've only found in this area. So we should really try and work on protecting this forest in Madagascar. But, back in history, we didn't have sort of, I guess, the kind of science, I suppose, that we didn't have the science to focus our efforts in conservation and figuring out where protected areas should be. So, for example, you have Yellowstone, right? And Yellowstone, yeah, Yellowstone. I'm sorry, I always get Yosemite and Yellowstone mixed up for some reason. So you have Yellowstone, and it was protected mostly because of all of the natural features there, right? So you have geysers, you have mountains, you have meadows, etc. Things that the people thought other people would want to see, and they thought it would be a good tourist place for people to go, riding trains, obviously, to make money for the railroad that was sort of fundraising or funding and fundraising the expeditions to protect Yellowstone. But if they really wanted to focus on actually protecting species back then, they probably would have done better protecting certain areas in California. Um, I know there's ecosystems in California where there's huge biodiversity, huge species richness rates of plants, of butterflies, etc. And those places weren't protected until very recently. And it's because it's mostly just grassland. So it kind of looks boring. Um, and people aren't really interested in bugs. And so, that place wasn't protected. But Yellowstone was. Also, you have to think of Namaka land, where, the place, this region that was once part of the De Beers, I believe, company mining locations, and it was grazed by sheep for centuries, and it's supposedly been heavily disturbed and degraded, but it's still being protected because of all the species richness. And you sort of think about the fact that uh, even though the science says that this place needs to be protected because of all this species richness, because of all this endemism, um, the fact is that it's been heavily degraded, and people have been living on the land for hundreds of years, and their livelihoods have not really influenced the plant communities all that much. So, sort of the question of why would you push people out of this area if people living there hasn't really put a dent in the community so far? Uh, So, and finally, for fortress style protected areas, does it put nature first? And this is where I'm going back to bugs again. So, it's, you know, protected areas are put aside for a lot of reasons, um, but it's mostly driven by donor whims, especially for protected areas that are sort of pushed by conservation NGOs like WWF, WCS, Conservation International, etc. And for that part, you have things like pandas, giant pandas, lions, you have African wild dogs, um, elephants. You have all these charismatic megafauna, as they call them, sort of driving the fundraising. So, WWF has a giant panda as their logo, and they use giant pandas a lot, or they have used giant pandas a lot in the past to sort of bring in the dollars. And people want to say that protecting these big, charismatic megafaunal species will sort of help, be like an umbrella effect. An umbrella species is a species that scientists believe that their if you protect enough habitat to sort of make it so that a population of that species can thrive, you'll protect habitat enough for a lot more species that are sort of underneath them. So, for example, I read a paper about using grizzly bears as an umbrella species and designing parks set around grizzly bear habitat needs. And the paper was suggesting that if you protected enough habitat to have a thriving population of grizzly bears, you would be protecting enough habitat for pumas, wolves, coyotes, red foxes, gray foxes, elk, moose, lynx, bobcats, weasels, all this other stuff. They were mostly focused on mammals, but you could think of all that land also protecting birds, bugs, etc. Um, and so there seems to be a sort of a similar concept within conservation funding, the idea of trickle down conservation. Um, if you protect or if you pull in money to protect a really charismatic species like tigers, you'll also be protecting things like gaur, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and langurs and sambar and all the other species that sort of live in the same habitats as tigers do. And there's a question of whether that actually works or not. So if you really wanted to put nature first, protected areas in particular would be more focused on things like uh, pollinators, right? Because pollinators, native bees, flies as well, mosquitoes, butterflies, they all sort of create or help create the vegetation that all of these other bigger animals depend upon. Um, but one of the more problematic things about fortress style protected areas is this idea that humans need to be out of the protected area for it to actually work. And so protected areas tend to equal displacement of people that are actually living in these areas at the time that the area is sort of set aside for protection. And this isn't only just physical displacement. So, sort of like, saying that you have 30 days to move out of this region or you're forced out. It's also economic displacement. So, economic displacement is when you make it so that people aren't able to make money the way that they um, were able to before, and you do not give them alternatives. So when we're talking economic displacement, we're talking about people who might go into rainforest and gather certain plants to make baskets that they sell at marketplaces. If you make it so that they can't go and gather those things and they have no other option to make money, then you are economically displacing them. With regards to actual physical displacement, there aren't a lot of great estimates on how many people have actually been displaced from protected areas. Because obviously a lot of protected areas were created during colonial times and people weren't actually making or keeping records necessarily of the people that they kicked out of certain areas or the people that they killed. Um, or if they were keeping those records, they destroyed them. So, for example, if you guys remember King Leopold and how he burned all those records in Belgium, he's not the only person who's done that. Britain has done that as well. They redacted a lot of documents with regards to their colonial history, and I'm pretty sure that I think there's a book on my to be read list that says that they actually destroyed a lot of records as well. So, um, for the most part, we will never know how many people were actually displaced. With regards to more recent protected areas, there's estimate that 4 million people in India will be physically displaced by protected area policies that are currently being debated. And there is an estimate, a guesstimate, that 16 million people will be displaced in Africa as well by protected areas in the near future. So just to sort of focus us on the idea of physical and economic displacement and protected areas in the fortress style. This is just an example of Krupp National Park. Um, so it was named Krupp after the indigenous people that were living there. And in 1937, this is in Cameroon, so it was a French colony. But in 1937, um, this administrative forest reserve was sort of created in this forest region where the Krupp people lived, and the indigenous people actually had exclusive rights to use the resources there. So they were given exclusive rights to use the resources for their personal use and for limited commercial use. Um, but in the 1970s, we have primatologists coming in to this newly independent country, and they're checking out the forest reserve, and they notice that there's this rare, I think it's a red colobus monkey or something that's living in this forest, and presumably has been living in this forest alongside indigenous people for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Um, but these primatologists, which actually included the scientist who would become the future uh, country director for Cameroon under WWF. Um, so these primatologists actually suggested to the then government of Cameroon to actually create this area, a protected area, a national park in this region. And then what happened was the national park comes into existence, and it is written that the indigenous people have no more rights to do anything within the protected area because they're going to, cause havoc supposedly in this protected area, even though they've been living there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So to sort of back up their belief at this point that the indigenous people would actually, you know, cause havoc on the natural resources and this rare monkey, WWF called in the scientists, independent scientists, to do a study on how the indigenous resource use actually affected populations of certain animals and species. Um, and what the person found was that, they found that the indigenous people weren't using them enough to harm populations. Their use was sustainable, and they actually suggested that they just let the people stay there. And WWF actually insisted that that person rewrite their report. and, suggest voluntary resettlement. And when they're talking voluntary resettlement, they're actually talking what the people actually told them, the government actually told them was that they either could move outside of the protected area and get money, or they could be forced out. There would be people coming with guns to kick them out of their villages. So what happened was, if I'm remembering this right, after 5 or so years, the villages finally finally agreed to this voluntary resettlement thing, and they left the protected area, moved out of the protected area. But I think WWF might have pulled their funding or something like that. Something happened, and the protected area sort of just fell through. So what happened was that the indigenous people actually ended up moving back to their original villages, and they're still living in the protected area today. So before we move on to community-based conservation, does anyone have any questions? No questions? Okay. So when we're talking about community-based conservation, we are talking about a conservation style where the local people will supposedly have a say in the community, the conservation policies and conservation actions. And it's supposed to be the social justice answer to fortress conservation. Became really popular in 1980s and 1990s. And so when we're thinking about taking humans out of nature, for the most part, as I've kind of mentioned before a lot in this class, people have been basically everywhere, um, even in areas where they might not be today. People have left their mark on the plant communities, the wildlife communities, etc., even if they're not there today. So me personally, I don't believe that taking humans out of nature is natural. When we're thinking about community-based conservation being grassroots, it's kind of, not necessarily true. Um, so a paper I read, Tran et al. 2020, saw that out of 26 indigenous protected areas out of 88 indigenous protected areas were actually indigenous led from the start. So that's 33%. The other 67% of these supposedly indigenous protected areas were probably started by conservation NGOs, outsiders coming in and saying, you should really try and protect this area, and then sort of giving over leadership, possibly. Do these community-based conservation sort of styles work, or do they work better than fortress style protected areas? It depends. So there's not a lot of studies on community-based conservation styles and how they actually conserve things either. And it's a huge oversight in the literature and the research, according to a lot of the papers that I read, the fact that no one's actually looking at how these different types of protected areas are actually protecting the species therein, if they're actually working or not. So in regards to why community-based conservation actually fails, because like fortress style protected areas, they do fail a lot. You have a lot of reasons why they might not work. So for the first point, community-based conservation assumes that the community is actually homogenous, that they've been there for maybe hundreds of years, that they have actual knowledge of the land, that they're all that they all know each other well, and that they work together well, and that they all have a similar goal. And if you think about just in your community, in the student community at PSU, um, you guys might all have a similar overarching goal, get a degree here, but you have different ways of going about it. You also might have different focuses. Um, some of you guys might be more focused on sports than class. Some of you guys might be more focused on jobs than class, etc. There's also a problem there just not being enough capacity. And again, we're talking about capacity building in these countries. Um, you know, Running and managing and doing conservation requires a lot of resources, a lot of know-how, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of money, and a lot of the times these local people don't have those. We've already gone over conflicts, and then there's also a lack of equity. So there are there might be social hierarchies within these communities. Maybe certain people are richer than others, and they're more able to sort of steer the conservation into ways that they want things to be conserved. Um, there are places where women do not have as many rights as men, so they're totally out of the decision making. And a lot of papers have found that to be a problem. So, yeah, okay. So I'm gonna actually break you guys into breakout rooms. If I can freaking get this up. Is everyone back? Yeah, never mind. Look. Okay. So it looks like a lot of y'all are saying sort of, let's see, education. So a lot of you are mentioning educating locals on the natural history of the bird, educating locals on why protecting the bird is important, educating kids to ensure longevity of the conservation organization or conservation actions and actions. You're talking about talking to locals, figuring out how they see the bird and how they interact with the species, getting community approval on plans, and getting their opinions on what is actually important to them, uh, getting jobs, so bringing jobs to the area, giving them incentive to preserve the bird instead of imposing punishments for harming the species. That's a good one. Yeah, okay. You guys had some good answers. Um, so one of the biggest reasons why community-based conservation fails is because there's not enough empowerment in the local community. Um, so this was sort of, well, that was sort of a trick question, unfortunately. So yeah, so when we're thinking about community-based conservation, a lot of times it is an NGO or a scientist or something like that, somebody from the outside coming into the community and saying, this species or this area that you live near is really important, and these are the reasons why it's important, and this is why I think you guys should protect it or help conserve it. And so we have a lot of the time, um, the initiatives for the conservation is actually coming from the local people themselves. And that's a big reason why community-based conservation often fails. Another big reason is because the local people aren't actually in charge of anything. So maybe community-based, or maybe the NGOs that come in, or the people that come in, will give them decision-making power when it comes to small things, but when it comes to the really big things, like actually like what kind of actions they do to preserve or conserve the animal or species that they're trying to focus on, they do not give them the power to make those decisions because they're afraid that local people will choose maybe something else, compared to actually conserving a species, right? Or maybe they'll choose an action that might harm the species a little, compared to just completely protecting it. So there's not enough empowerment or trust from the outside actors, um, when it comes to local people and how they'll conserve their resources. And this has been seen in a lot of papers, but in a lot of case studies too. So for one example, this is an example from Scotland. What they found was that local community noticed, it was a fishing community. They noticed that their fisheries had sort of taken a decline. And what they decided to do was on their own, they decided to petition for a no-take zone, and it took years for them to actually get this put into sort of like the law, I guess, in the area. But once it was put into writing and it was codified and this no take zone was actually put in, um, over the years, they saw increases in biodiversity of species. They saw increases in the size of their catches, in the age of the fish that they caught, and the density of the takeable species. This was completely grassroots. It was locals, people who were actually living in the area and fishing on this area, in these waters, that noticed there was a problem and wanted to do something about it, and that's why it succeeded. For another paper that sort of goes over the same thing, um, we have this idea, you guys mentioned a lot, integrating conservation and livelihood goals, giving them jobs when it comes to protecting the bird. Uh, and we do see that if people are given jobs in conservation, they will often work in sort of a conservation focused way, but the benefits have to outweigh the losses. And if you're focused mostly on giving people jobs, you're going to run into a lot of problems that we're going to be talking about Thursday. Um, uh, where else? Yeah. So theory 3, give communities control of the natural resources. This is where people have a huge problem, um, where local people aren't empowered and where outside actors don't trust people because they're afraid they're going to choose maybe development over conservation. Um, but they found that by giving the locals power, actual decision making power, and trusting them, um, a lot of times community based conservation does work. And a lot of you guys mentioned conservation education, and it's always a good thing to sort of do scientific outreach and stuff like that. But this paper actually found that conservation education doesn't really change behaviors. Um, and this is obvious, right? So if you think about it, like if you, for example, made your money by again making baskets that are made of reeds that you have to go collect in the forest area, and you realize that, or someone comes into your community and tells you that this rare bird actually lives in these reeds, and you can't collect the reeds anymore because it's actually hurting the bird, you're gonna keep on collecting reeds because you still need to make money and you still need to make these baskets to make money, right? So unless you actually change the reason why people are doing the things that they're doing that might be harming animals or species, you're not going to change anything by just educating them. So the takeaways from this lecture, is just a reminder, global protected area extent has increased throughout the years, but whether protected areas actually work or not is still up in the air. Forest conservation does have direct ties to colonialism, and community-based conservation works best when it's actually grassroots, which is a very rare occurrence because a lot of the times NGOs and scientists will come out from outside and be like, I was studying your species and it's declining and you guys have to do something about it, and they'll try and push local people to act the way that they want them to act. Um, and again, that there's not enough studies to show that either fortress style or community-based conservation actually works, or which one is best. So it's really just kind of an opinion, I guess, at this point. So that's it